Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and this is my next Q&A video where someone asked me personally, how did you work with your parts that kept you in a toxic relationship? So I am going to share my personal experience, which means that it's not prescriptive for you. Someone was asking me, I'll often wear the t-shirt that says N equals one, and they asked me what that means. And N is in experiment language, in science language, is the sample size of an experiment. So N equals one means that an experiment is an experiment of one, right? That this is what worked for me, and hopefully it's an example and inspires you, but you are also an experiment of one. And so get curious about your own system, your own parts, and where you are on your journey and what the next step is for you, or what it looks like for you to love whatever is alive in you in any given moment, right? But I am going to share with you, and I did do some kind of brainstorming about the parts of me around it. So I did make a little PowerPoint to share those parts with you to answer the question. So, parts who stayed in a toxic relationship and how I worked with them and continue to work with them, because there are still parts in my system. Work is maybe not the best word for it. How I interact with them, how I connect with them. So these are the parts that kept me in a toxic relationship. And there are likely more. I was trying to ask inside if there were more. I may come up with more later, but some of the big ones were loyal parts, parts that learned that it's important to keep my word, to be a person of integrity, to keep my commitments. My vows, my marriage vows are very important, right? I want to be a loyal person. So those parts that hold those beliefs were big. In the center, you see fawning parts and inner critic parts. And these are parts who learned through culture and through personal experience that I had to please the person in front of me to stay alive, right? So that was their job, right, was to help me detect what the person in front of me wanted and do that. And then the inner critics are shaming parts inside that tell me that I am the one who is to blame or the problem, and I just need to try to control myself, or they're trying to control their parts essentially, but they're very inward focused, right? So instead of looking at the person outside of me and saying what they're doing is not okay, they're turned inward to say, what is it about you that is not okay? And they have good intention because they're trying to control what they feel like they have control over, right? Which is the parts inside of me. There are also good girl parts, and these are more, um, I was going to say, they're kind of exiles who really have the belief that they are bad, right? That they need to be good, but that their essence is bad. I'm going to talk more about how they developed as well through religious burdens. But these parts really crave worth, and they seek it from people outside of me, right? So I've got to get the approval of the significant people in my life, and they've got to give me that worth. So those are kind of those young, vulnerable parts who are desperately seeking love and value. And then the other parts that were really active around like keeping me in a toxic relationship and not letting me get out were the parts who fear the unknown, right? It's like, at least this hell that I'm in, I know I have some information about. Maybe I can, the critics and the fawning parts can kind of try to control it somewhat. And so there's more fear about the lack of clarity of what's on the other side of leaving the relationship. Okay. Now, I have a whole a whole thing here of let's see, I don't know the way it's appearing to you if I'm going to be covering this. Hopefully not. If I am, I'll read it to you. But so I had a lot of religious burdens that basically parts that held these beliefs that kept me from leaving a very abusive relationship. So probably one of the biggest ones is the one on top, is the parts that believed I am bad, a quote unquote sinner at my core, and I deserve punishment. So these parts were punished on the inside by my inner critics, and it wasn't unusual to be punished by someone outside of me because they felt like, well, of course, I deserve that, right? So when there was a quote unquote toxic behavior, abusive behavior toward me, they accepted it as justifiable because I am at my core a bad person deserving of punishment. And then another one was that coming down here, as a wife, I'm responsible for my husband. So this was a big belief. There were verses that were shared about, if a man is kind of going away from the right path, the woman's responsibility is to pray for him and to stay the course, and her influence will eventually, get him to come on the path. So this really promoted in my system a lot of codependence, this kind of hopefulness that if I'm just good enough, uh, I will save him, I will fix him, I will, um, ultimately it just comes down to me that it's all my responsibility. I'm taking responsibility for myself and for him. The next one was that anger, this was a verse that was quoted to me repeatedly as a child. It says, anger does not achieve the righteousness of God. And basically, the message I got was that anger is never, ever, ever okay. And it wasn't until I was 42 that I understood the value of anger. I genuinely believed that it was an evil, terrible thing that was never okay to feel or definitely act on. Now I understand the incredible value of it. So, in valuing me and my needs and coming up to help me create distance with harmful behavior, right? But because I didn't have any access to the anger that was basically telling me, you have value and this person is treating you in a way that is not okay, set a boundary, say no, or leave or whatever. I didn't have access to that natural human instinct, right? Because that was cut off and exiled in my system. And then the other one was this belief, the religious belief that divorce is never okay. And in some religious circles, they would say for infidelity. There are some religious circles that will say for abuse it's okay, but the really big push was you stay committed no matter what. You're essentially a martyr if you're being abused, right? And this is your lot in life, and there's nothing you can do about it. And if you do seek separation or divorce, you will be completely ostracized and exiled from your community, which is exactly what happened. That was a result. So that part was right, that I would be banished if I sought separation and divorce. Okay, so there's a lot of parts that have fear, and like my husband, my current wonderful, loving husband, Brian points out, when we have religiously burdened parts, he calls them godlike parts, right? Because it's like our parts cannot argue with this because we're told that it comes from God. So it's very hard to stand against that. It's considered the ultimate truth. Truth. Okay. So, what was my path out of a toxic relationship? And essentially, I won't go into detail here, but my first husband had a lot of trauma and abuse, and so his system was organized with very extreme parts that acted out in tragic ways to protect him, but they were very, a lot of rage toward me, a lot of control, a lot of humiliating of me, mocking of me, shaming of me, very critical, you know, belittling, cussing me out. And then a lot of parts that would just negate my needs, and were neglectful in many ways. And then parts that had addiction and were abusive of him as well, right? So he has this just very highly protective, extreme system, and of course, protecting really, really painful exiles in himself. But each person, right? When we recognize, we can both at the same time recognize why the person makes sense and that their protective parts are trying to protect them, and value our system and take our system away from the harm that their protectors are causing us, right? So it's a both and. I recognize that there was nothing personal, and he had a lot of suffering inside of him. But that also doesn't mean that it's okay for his protective parts to harm me and my system. So, okay. So this is my path out. The first step for me was, and this was really just my parts were exhausted of trying so hard to fix and influence him and help him, that I gave up trying to fix him or myself. Now, that's sort of not really true. Initially, the focus did shift from trying to fix him to trying to fix me. So my big inner critics and managers really did amp up, but it was still a helpful shift because all this energy that was going at trying to help him turned and was trying to help me, which I am the only one that I ultimately do have control over. So that was helpful. And that energy was really turned toward exploring and experimenting with ways to help myself. So two things I want to just point out here. One is kind of this letting go, releasing, giving up of effort, of efforting to try to control or fix another person. And then the second one is this attitude of exploration and experimentation, of being open and willing to try things and test them out and see what the fruit of the tree is. That I have found is it's a quality of self, honestly, that I would add to the qualities of self, is just the flow, right? The willingness to try things and explore and experiment. Okay. So then the next thing that came, my exploring and experimenting for me took me to my public library, where I got all kinds of self-help books and was just reading all kinds of things that I previously wouldn't have had the energy to read, or maybe even the permission from the religious community to read. So some of the first books I read were Martha Beck's book called The Joy Diet and Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. And these books were just revolutionary for me, because at the time, I the concept of being present and contemplative and still and quiet and going inside were completely foreign to me. It was very, very small. I've talked about this, but I would read like 2 lines from Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, because that's all I could absorb at a time. And I would go to the bathroom, I would read it, and I would sit there, and I began to practice presence in the bathroom. And it felt like bliss to me, because I was so stuck in my head of all my intellectual parts of past traumas, present traumas, future traumas, or whatever. But in that moment, in the bathroom, with the sunlight coming through the window, I was at peace. And I realized, often in this present moment, I am okay. And so I started to feel a little bit of security. And the thing in Martha's book, The Joy Diet, is she has all these like ingredients, and you have to be able to practice one, can't remember, I think it's 10 days. before you add the next one. And her very first ingredient is nothing. Practice nothing for 10 minutes. Now, because of my religious upbringing, if she had said, practice meditation, my parts would have been like, oh no, that's evil, right? But because she called it nothing, I didn't realize that I was practicing meditation essentially. And it was so hard for me. I did have parts, manager parts that like made me sit there with willpower and do nothing, right? But it still had a benefit of slowing me down enough to even notice what my body was feeling, what was alive in me, right? And that kind of I feel like is the foundation of every other thing I learned that was healthy. And I will often still say that healing always occurs in this moment as I love whatever is alive in me. So I don't have to think about, well, what am I going to do about all that? Or what am I going to do in the future? It's just always about what's here now. Can I bring loving attention to that? Right? And that's really where I learned it. And this, I would say, oh, that went away. Um, when I gave up trying to fix my first husband, this was probably about 15 years ago now. And then I started practicing stillness within months of that. And then eventually I started to experiment with self-love and self-compassion. And then I have this beautiful statement that I got from Thich Nhat Hanh, beloved, I see your suffering and I am here. So again, going to the library, reading books that were essentially considered dangerous by my religious tribe. And so there were parts of me that were kind of like, oh no, I'm doing something wrong here. But I now identify that myself resonated, resonated with what Martha Beck was saying. It resonated with Eckhart Tolle talking about presence. And the fruit of it was so good that I never went back once I tried it. But Marianne Williamson's Return to Love talks about that we are a good and beloved at our core. And that really challenged the religious parts of me that believed I was bad and deserved punishment. So there were parts that were so fearful to even experiment with that belief, that I am lovable. But something in me, I think it was myself, because I didn't know IFS yet at this point. Something in me said, just experiment with this, just try it and see what the fruit is, right? And this, it was able to use my religious language and say, Jesus says, judge a tree by its fruit. So just try it out for a week. Pretend that you are lovable for a week and see what happens. And to my astonishment, I did not become a murderous, gluttonous person. The fruit was so good. I had so much more confidence in myself that I could give from overflow to other people that I never went back from there. And then I started studying Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion and trying out little self-compassion exercises. What I often say now is looking back on that, it wasn't necessarily myself doing it, but it was, sometimes I call self-like parts a bridge. The self-like parts bridge the self to the parts because the self-like parts are basically managers. They have an agenda. They're trying to get me to, practice this saying, put your hand on your heart. And, it's not, doesn't feel necessarily natural, but it's giving my parts a taste of self before they can handle it to see if it's safe, right? Because my religious part said it is not safe to love yourself. So that effectively cut me off from my self energy because myself loves me unconditionally, right? And so I had to test it out first. And then that's when I saw Thich Nhat Hanh in an Oprah interview where he was talking about saying to people outside of us that are suffering, our loved ones, beloved, I see your suffering and I'm here. And he talked about how that is the most powerful statement. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to feel like you have to say the right words. It's just a communication that I am aware of your suffering and I'm here with you. You're not alone. And that became for me the foundation of what self offers to my parts. And so I would, whenever I would feel um, pain inside of me, rather than seeking that worth outside from my partner or from other people, I would go to a private place, the bathroom or the closet, and I would put my hand on my heart and say, "Oh, beloved, I see your suffering and I'm here. I'm here with you." And my suffering parts would just go, "Oh, oh, you see me?" Right? That's all they wanted. And when I realized that I could turn what I could give them, what they desperately wanted and were grasping from other people, it was revolutionary. So I was no longer grasping at my first husband to give it to me, and he couldn't. He just wasn't in a position to even be able to give that to me, because he didn't wasn't able to give it to himself, and we can only give from overflow. So from that point, I was kind of doing this meditation or making time for stillness, and I stopped forcing myself to do 10 minutes and I just did as much time as my system wanted to do, even if it was 10 seconds, just to check in what's alive in me, take a beat, take a breath. And my system began to crave that more and more. And I began to turn toward whatever was there. If something was suffering, and say, "I'm here with you." If something was agitated, I was, "What do you need?" So I started calling this the kind watcher, because it wasn't just this objective, you know, observer. It was kind, it was loving, right? Um, and it wanted to help if it could, but it didn't have to do anything to help. It was just, "I'm here with you. Do you need anything from me?" And so that's, again, this is all before I met IFS. So I'm gradually moving in this direction, basically, of connecting my parts to self, even though I didn't call it that at the time. And and then I started exploring, because I was just experimenting with things. I started, and this is probably years in, but I started exploring, uh, shamanic journeying and soul retrieval and stuff like that, where I basically, my current adult loving self is time traveling back to parts of me that are stuck in moments of trauma and, in this religious conditioning and different things. And I started giving them what they needed, a loving presence, a witness, and reparenting, redoing the situations and bringing them out of it and unburdening them. And then through that, I started getting more access to anger, that was brought out of exile, and more self-value. And around the time I was doing that is when I met IFS. That's why IFS just resonated with me, because it's like I had discovered IFS on my own, essentially, and IFS, the model, just kind of gave language and structure a little bit more to it, but I was already practicing it. So another thing that happened as far as allowing me to leave, because some of this work is done even after I left, to be honest, but is that I became more afraid of the toxic known than the unknown. So things started to get more and more scary and dangerous and untenable, especially as I began to have self-value and self-love. I realized that no one deserved the way I was being treated, not even me. Um, and so as I healed, the parts of me who wanted out of the relationship began to outnumber the parts who wanted to stay. So it's really like a tipping point, right? I tell people, you will stay in a toxic relationship until the parts of you who want out outnumber the parts who want to stay. So my suggestion is to really get to know the parts who want to stay and why, and what are their concerns, because if their concerns can be met about why they don't want to get out. And essentially, that's what was happening in my system, right? The parts of me that had concern, their concerns were met. So I say, for example, my parts who wanted to stay for the kids, right, realized that they wanted to leave for the kids, that I didn't want to set the example for my kids of a toxic relationship that they would repeat. And I didn't want that, even though I felt like at the time my partner was treating me really, really bad. He wasn't treating them really, really bad. But I realized I would never want them to think that the way he treated me was normal, and for them to then be in relationships like that in the future. So, so basically the concerns of my parts started to be met, the parts that wanted to stay, right? So if you are in a toxic relationship and you have parts that are keeping you in it, obviously there are parts who really desperately want you to get out. But if you are staying, it's because you have parts who want to stay, who have concerns and fears about leaving. And their concerns and fears have to be met. And once they are met, the tipping point will shift naturally. So at that point, I became self-led. I was my own primary caregiver, as Dick Schwartz says, like I was talking about earlier, my parts knew that they could get the love and support and witness from me, that they didn't have to grasp for it outside. Um, and so I would turn inside and listen to all the parts and meet their concerns. And then after I listened to all of them, together we could make a clear, creative, courageous plan going forward. So there was by the time I left, I wasn't dragging some parts along with me. My whole system had clarity that that was the right thing to do. And there was no desire to be angry or get revenge on my first husband or blame him or anything like that. I saw very clearly that he was a very tortured soul, but also I saw and valuable, but also that I was valuable and I didn't need to stay and be tortured. And so that path became really clear. And my parts trusted that myself would care for them. The day I left, it didn't go smoothly. My first husband's parts, uh, they often say, at the point you leave is the most dangerous, which is true because the other person's parts that are protecting them by controlling you feel very threatened and can escalate and get violent and extreme. And so I had to have a lot of support. I ended up having to call the police to help me and to go into hiding and some of those things. So it can be a very dangerous time, but I still knew that it was the right thing to do, even though it was scary and it was a risk, essentially. I remember feeling like, I don't know if you've seen Indiana Jones, when basically it looks like there's this cliff and he just has to step out into the abyss. And as he steps, the bridge rises up or appears. And each step, the bridge appears, right? That's exactly how it felt. Like I was stepping into pitch black darkness, a pit and I was just going to fall down. But again, that was less scary than the hell I was already in at that point. And so I was willing to do it. But I did it in a very self-led way. Like I said, I had met with my parts, met their concerns, tried to get as much, you know, support and preparation behind it. Some of those things didn't happen the way I wanted them to, and I had to maneuver in the moment and kind of be creative about it. But by that time, I knew that it was the right thing. And so even though it was very, very difficult, I had clarity and courage and confidence about it. So, and just a couple other notes I want to say is that I tried to leave at least 3 times before that. That was at least the fourth time I tried to leave, and none of those stuck. I would end up returning um, because the parts of me that were afraid to leave and be on my own, that were had concerns, whether they were religious or other things, their concerns had not been met yet. And so the parts who wanted to leave kind of, like I said, dragged them, forced them out. So if you're trying to leave a toxic relationship and you haven't met the concerns of the parts who want to stay, the parts who want to leave may get you to leave, but the parts who want to stay are going to drag you back. And that's why it's actually really common for people in abusive situations to try to leave and keep coming back several times. So for me, that final time when I left, um, all my parts were on board. I had complete clarity that that's what needed to happen for good. And again, had no animosity or anger or hatred or anything toward my first husband. Just knew that because I had spent years thinking and hoping that he would change and he would get better and trying to communicate with him and just realizing that that wasn't going to happen. Like I said, I had given up on trying to change him or hoping that he would change. So releasing hope is actually one of the big steps to being able to have clarity and move on and do what I needed, for myself and my kids. Um, Now, the next chapter of this story it does not necessarily get better, but it got worse in essence. Um, a year after I left my first husband, he died by suicide. And then there was a whole other trauma that I needed to heal from that created so many exiles, so many deeply terrorized, horrified, wounded, um, uh, big, huge inner critics inside of my system. So in the next video, so next Friday, I will make a video or I'll post a video about all the parts that I've worked with around my first husband's death by suicide. So stay tuned for that. But if you have any questions about working with the parts around being able to leave a toxic or abusive relationship, and your situation may have lots of different details that are different than mine. You're welcome to share about that in the comments, or if you have any questions about my experience, uh, feel free to put those in the comments as well. And just thank you for your compassionate witness.